Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our latest lecture and webinar titled The Historic Landscapes of Cheddington, Buckinghamshire, Evidence from Excavations in 2018. Or, without giving too much away, the Roman and medieval period agricultural landscape on the edge of a small settlement in Bucks. Starting with myself this evening, your humble host. I'm Rob Sutton, Director of Heritage Consultancy at Cotswold Archaeology, an archaeologist with over 20 years in the game and someone that was specifically involved in this project. You'll hear from me for a few more minutes while I cover some of the housekeeping before introducing our speaker for this evening. But just as a reminder, your cameras and microphones are not engaged, so we can't hear or see you. But we would like to hear from you. So first up, those of you which are familiar with Zoom will recognize two functions for you to communicate with us. The first one is the chat box. And I would just like to suggest that we'd love to hear from you about where you might be based, and where you might be listening to us this evening and watching us. Here I am in cool spring evening in Worcester in the West Midlands, not too far away from the city. In fact, I've just heard the cathedral bells ringing. And I see some messages coming through. Hi from Plymouth. Hello there. I've got somebody who's listening from the United States. That's lovely. We're going to keep that chat box open for about 10 minutes or so. We've got somebody who's in Cheddington. Brilliant. Just down the road. Great stuff. We're going to keep this open for about 10 minutes or so. And then we're going to move to hear from you to the second function, which you'll also recognize at the bottom of your screens there, which is the Q&A function. This is going to be open throughout the evening as we collect questions to put to the panel of experts after the talk has concluded. And just FYI, these questions can only be seen by myself, the speaker, and the panel of experts. The talk will be around 50 minutes, giving us a nice 20 minutes or so at the end for a Q&A. And FYI, if attendees are experiencing technical problems, they can contact us via the Q&A, and we'll try to help you where we can. We are also recording this lecture this evening, and it'll be available on Cotswold Archaeology's YouTube channel very soon. A couple of other little points of housekeeping. As you leave the webinar later this evening, at the end of tonight's event, there'll be a short survey to help us gather your feedback. There are only 4 questions, and the survey will take you less than 5 minutes, I promise, but we'd really like to get some feedback from you if possible. Just seeing more people coming in, lots of people from locally in Buckinghamshire, in Wing and High Wycombe, Oxfordshire, somebody over in Cambridgeshire as well. I do think the first attendee who said hello from, we've got another one from Maryland. Somebody said hello from America. So we've definitely get people tuning in from all over the world tonight, which is wonderful. So without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker and my colleague and friend of over a decade, Mr. Martin Watts, the Director of Research and Engagement at Cotswold Archaeology. Martin has been a professional archaeologist for over 35 years. He'll be glad for me to say out loud. Working across the Midlands, London and Devon before joining Cotswold Archaeology over 20 years ago. He's been head of the publications department for nearly 20 years now. He's a highly knowledgeable and expert archaeologist, and has had a hand in many, if not all, of the most important publications Cotswold Archaeology has produced over the last 2 decades. And as I'll say again, without further ado, I'll pass over to Martin to allow him to take this lecture forward. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Rob. Just allow me to share my screen with everybody so you can see what's going on. I think that is the one that I want. There we are. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'll be describing to you the results of Cotswold Archaeology's investigations that we undertook in 2018 over 3 fields in advance of housing development in the village of Cheddington in Buckinghamshire. And the housing development sponsors were the Society of Merchant Venturers, And we're very grateful to them and their agents, Savills, for their support in undertaking the project and all of the post-excavation work that followed that. So our work at Cheddington uncovered the remains of a multi-period site with evidence dating from the Iron Age, the Roman period, and from the medieval through to post-medieval times. Although no direct evidence for past settlement was found at the site, the results of the excavation, along with the artifacts and the environmental samples recovered from the site, have given us new insights into Cheddington's past, from Iron Age pastoral farming to the way that the Romans organised their landscape and treated their dead, through to the origins of the village and how wider events in medieval and later times affected the use and development of the site and its wider landscape. I should add at this point that the talk does include a section dealing with human remains, and I will give warning when I have arrived at that section. So here's a topographic map of the Vale of Aylesbury, and here is our site at Cheddington. Not sure if you can see the words on this, but it is located here in the middle of the Vale of Aylesbury, midway between Aylesbury down to the southwest here and Dunstable up to the northeast here, with the chalk escarpment of the Chiltern Hills overlooking the Vale from the southeast. The Vale comprises mainly heavy clay soils and is largely flat, though there are a couple of chalk outcrops in the Vale right here within the immediate vicinity of the village. But that's a quick view at the topography of the area. So here's a modern map of Cheddington, and here you can see the chalk outcrops of Southend Hill here and West End Hill here, which unsurprisingly are just to the south and west of the village. Our site is shown in red and comprised 3 pasture fields just to the west of the village, which have now been developed for housing. So this is what the site looked like before the fieldwork began. It may not be too obvious from this photo, but all this field, and in fact all 3 fields, contain slight earthworks. So our first task was to undertake a survey of these features prior to any below ground investigations. And here are the results of that survey. As you can see, there were features recorded in all 3 of the fields. You may not be able to pick out the annotation on that, but we were able to interpret what these features were and what they represented from looking at this early 19th century map, which was extremely helpful in allowing us to understand what the recorded earthworks once were. So over here, recorded in the top field, we can see that this was once a trackway that led to these former open fields. We can see the earthworks in the middle field here were once the boundaries of paddocks lying to the rear of this farmhouse just outside of our excavation area. And the earthworks in the lower field, or the southern field, were probably field boundaries relating to the medieval manor house, which formerly stood in this moated site to the west. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the line of Cheddington High Street is believed to follow the alignment of a Roman road. More on that later, but do take note of the alignment of the road running from the southeast up to the northwest. Now, I'm very fond of this map, and I'll return to it again during this talk a couple of times more. But in general, the use of historic maps such as this are a really important part of interpreting sites and understanding how historic landscapes such as that around Cheddington developed. And it's worth noting at this point just how much the village has grown to the east of our site by comparing the site in the early 19th century to the site at the beginning of the 21st century. You see all these housing infilling between the original village and our site. Well, following the earthwork survey, we undertook trial trenching in all 3 fields, and the remains we uncovered in the central field were considered to be of sufficient significance to warrant open area excavation just within the central field here. So here we are in time-honoured fashion of opening the site up, stripping it by machine, and here we can see more of the site having been stripped, and the first features appearing and being excavated and recorded. It's fair to say that this wasn't the prettiest of sites. The clay soils of the Aylesbury Vale make it extremely difficult to spot archaeological features, and enormous credit must go to our site team who were on this site for several months out in all weathers trying to identify these features and make sense of things. But at the end of the dig, this is what they came up with. This is the plan of the excavation. So here you can see lots and lots of ditches crisscrossing each other across the site, several pits in clusters in certain parts of the site, and some soil horizons here in marked in olive green, which overlay some features and were cut by others. So a real sort of palimpsest of archaeological remains that we then had to try and make sense of. And through observing the relationships between the intercutting features and from the dating evidence from recovered artifacts, considering spatial relationships between these features, we were able to make some sense of the site and identify which features belonged to the various periods of activity that are represented on this site. So, the earliest features that we identified dated to the late Iron Age, so it's sometime between 100 BC and AD 43, which of course is the date of the Roman conquest of Britain. The earliest feature, we believe, was this D-shaped enclosure, which measured 21 meters wide by 37 meters long, and probably with an entrance here to the southeast. The ditches survived up to 1 meter wide and up to half a meter deep, and the pottery recovered from these ditches was of transitional late Iron Age to early Roman date. There was also a few areas of late Iron Age pits, including this pit here, which had within it about a third of a jar of a grog-tempered ware jar, which is a typical form of transitional late Iron Age to early Roman pottery. A little bit later, perhaps in the early Roman period, we have what appears to be a second enclosure, possibly contemporary with the first enclosure over here. Now, most of this enclosure lay beyond the limit of excavation to the northeast, but we could see that there was again another entrance here with a 5 meter entrance wide just in this location here. There are a couple of interesting pits I should mention. First of all, over here, the pit right in the entranceway to this enclosure contained the remains of a horse skull. So that was possibly deposited deliberately as a structure deposit in the entrance of this enclosure. And just outside the entrance of the second enclosure was another pit, which possibly originated as a grain storage pit, but had later been used for waste disposal, and which produced again late Iron Age to early Roman pottery, and also cattle bones, which had evidence of gnawing on them. And all these other pits generally produced fragments of early Roman pottery. Some of them had a lot of crop processing wastes and animal bone in them, suggestive of domestic activity nearby. So what it looks like is that we're on the sort of margin of a nearby late Iron Age settlement, but that it probably wasn't on the site itself. And these types of late Iron Age subcircular enclosures are commonly found on clay soils across the whole of southern Britain, where they're generally interpreted as enclosures for herd management and possibly seasonal corrals for sorting livestock. So what we think we're looking at here is evidence for pastoral farming predominantly on this landscape, but with a nearby late Iron Age settlement where crop processing and arable farming was also taking place. Looking more widely at the landscape around, the late Iron Age remains from our site may relate to the late Iron Age reuse of a small multi-vallate hill fort that was on Southern Hill. And the evidence from here suggests that while this was principally occupied from the early to middle Iron Age, so that's about 600 to 300 BC, it was also occupied again from around 100 BC to AD 50. And this hill fort was an outlier to a series of hill forts that were established along the Chilterns escarpment in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Looking more widely still, the whole of this area was part of Catavaloni territory, and they were the Iron Age tribe whose capital was centered on St Albans or Verulamium, which is located on the other side of the Chilterns, to the southeast rather. And it's also worth noting that the late Iron Age and early Roman pottery assemblage recovered from the site had an abundance of Verulamium region products, indicating that the material hadn't travelled far, and also that the likely settlement was of relatively low status. Moving on into the early Roman period, so from AD 43 through to around about the end of the 2nd century AD, we saw this period saw the abandonment of those earlier possibly pastoral enclosures and the establishment of this rectilinear field system represented by these parallel ditches marked in blue. Their general alignment of northeast and southwest, and the distance between these alignments was about 20 to 25 meters. Over here was a very narrow gap, providing an entrance in this ditch out to the area to the northwest, which may have been an open field area. The dating evidence from this phase is early Roman pottery of 1st to 2nd century date. We think maybe this field system was in use in the 1st century AD. So the two parallel strips with the open area to the northwest are defined by what appear to be rather ragged ditches. However, associated banks may have been more regularly defined than these ditches appear, and there does appear to be more structure to this field system than is initially apparent, with the ditch terminals lining up at right angles to the orientation of the parallel strips. So you can see here this ditch terminal lined up with this ditch terminal. These two over here line up as well, as do these two here broadly. So it may be that despite looking quite ragged, there was a much more flexible use of space here, perhaps defined by fences or hurdles that have left no trace for us archaeologically. Importantly, the orientation of the field system ran perpendicular to the line of the probable Roman road to the northeast. And it seems that the alignment of that road had a profound influence on the reorganization of the landscape in the early Roman period, certainly to the south of the road, following the Roman conquest and the subsequent road building scheme. And perhaps to include not just this field system, but also the establishment of a farmstead in the landscape near to the site. Of slightly later date is the ditch shown in green. This seems to be a realignment of the far western ditch here, perhaps just a renewal of the bank rather than the recutting of a different boundary. The telltale sign here is that the entrance through to this possible open area to the northwest is retained. Both of these ditches line up here, so we suspect that this was just a little bit of an adjustment to this field system rather than representing wholesale change. However, we do get wholesale change a little bit later in the early Roman period, so this is still dated to somewhere between 43 AD and 200 AD. Perhaps this episode of activity taking place in the 2nd century AD, where this second rectilinear field system was imposed on a slightly different angle to the first. So you can see here it's a slightly more north-northeast to south-southwest alignment, and the width of this parallel field system was slightly wider. The original ones were around 25 meters. This one's up to about 35 meters wide, and you can see it clearly cut across the earlier field system that it appears to have completely replaced. So it was established by the cutting of a couple of simple ditches, parallel ditches in the first instance, then the development continued with the partial recutting of parts of these ditches, possibly extending this further to the north, and then the final episode of development of this particular field system is shown in the orange ditches here, which include a ditch that then ran across the enclosed area, dividing it into two, with a small entranceway between the two retained at the eastern end here, which was around about 5 meters long. It's interesting to note that this ditch here, ditch K, as we labelled it, yielded a very large assemblage of early Roman pottery, as well as fuel ash slag and iron smelting waste, indicative of a nearby, again, relatively low status settlement that may also have included an ironworking site. What isn't clear is exactly what the motivation was for the realignment of this field system. The previous field systems hadn't just been abandoned and allowed to fill in naturally. The southern part of the green ditch down here, when we excavated it, we found that there was a near complete skeleton of a cow buried in the backfill of this ditch. So it appears there was some sort of special deposit and perhaps some sort of closing ceremony to the earlier field system. But a huge amount of effort was expended in reorganizing the space in what appears to be a relatively minor tweak to the orientation. So it's unclear what the processes were that demanded this realignment. It's also unclear exactly when it was abandoned, but the pottery recovered, particularly from ditch K here, contained very few early fine wares, which perhaps indicates abandonment before the importation of Central Gaulish products, which began in the 2nd century AD. And the absence of clearly late Roman material from these ditches also indicates that active maintenance and development of the field system really didn't continue into the 3rd century AD. So this was definitely in use and pretty much abandoned all during the early Roman period in the 2nd century AD. Roman landscape development seems to have followed on the site, seems to have followed a fairly typical pattern for this part of central England. where there was a major expansion of Roman farmsteads and field systems in the early to middle Roman period. Its transformation in the later Roman period, either going out of use or somehow becoming less archaeologically visible to us through the ditches silting up, is also part of a wider pattern across Roman Britain. So the later ditches certainly continued as landscape features to the end of the Roman period. And we know this because in the late Roman period, there suddenly appeared some activity in this corner of the field. And here's a close-up of that corner of the field. We can see several pits indicated. These were dug, and also a couple of graves lying about 4 meters apart from each other. Now, this is the part where I will talk for about 5 minutes now about human remains that were recovered on site and show pictures of human remains. So if you would prefer not to hear or see that content, then please look away, turn down the volume, and do rejoin us in 5 minutes or so. Okay, so here's the first grave, the northern grave, which we found to contain the remains of an adult male who was around 45 years age at death. And the grave wasn't a regular grave shape, and it may have been a reused pit. Now, we have these graves radiocarbon dated, and the radiocarbon date from this particular grave came back as being in the 5th or 6th century AD. So quite possibly this was a post-Roman burial sometime after AD 410. The second grave contained the remains of 2 adult females that had been interred together. The older female here on the right was around about 45 years of age at death, and the younger female here was in her late 20s. And she was buried with the bones of a fetus of around about 32 to 34 weeks gestation. And these bones were found, the fetus bones were found lying in her chest area, suggesting that the fetus may have been delivered before death. But this grave had suffered from some plough damage, so it wasn't possible to be absolutely sure of that. And it's possible that this was the fetus had been buried still in utero. There was no evidence of a recut, and the carbon-14 dates recovered from both the adult skeletons were virtually identical, extending from the 3rd to the 5th century, but centering most probably on the 4th century. So this communal grave was almost certainly late Roman, and all 3 individuals within it were almost certainly buried at the same time altogether. At this point in the Roman period, single inhumations were the norm. So this triple burial was somewhat unusual. Well, up until a few years ago, that's about as much as we could have said for certain about the 3 individuals buried in this grave. We could assume that they were from one family, but we wouldn't know that for certain. But recent advances in ancient DNA sequencing have given archaeologists a whole new window on the past, and particularly regarding ancient burial rites and kinship. Now, some of you may have read about this in Current Archaeology in December, or perhaps seen this story on our website. But to learn more about why these individuals have been buried together, we submitted samples of DNA from all 3 individuals in the grave, and the DNA was sequenced as part of the 1000 Ancient Genomes project at the Francis Crick Institute in London. And the results we got back meant that we discovered the following facts. First of all, that the fetus was that of a baby boy. Second, that we confirmed that he was the son of the younger woman in the grave that he was found lying on. We also discovered that the two women were unrelated, which came as a bit of a surprise until the fourth fact came along, which was, while the women were unrelated, the boy had a second-degree relationship with the older woman in the grave, which means that she was probably his paternal grandmother or aunt. So while the two women in the grave were unrelated, they did share kinship through marriage. And this is a relationship between these individuals that just a few years ago, we would never have known anything about. So that's the power of aDNA sequencing and what it can tell archaeology now and in the future. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to the medieval period, and I said I'd come back to my favourite early 19th century map, as it's particularly useful for locating the site in the context of medieval and later Cheddington, and there are several features of interest I'd like to highlight. So as noted previously, the village in the early 19th century was spread out here along the High Street and along the line of what was believed to be a Roman road coming down off the Chilterns and heading off in this direction towards the northeast. So to the southwest of the site, as already mentioned, this moated site is believed to be the location of Cheddington Manor during the medieval period. To the northeast of the site is the location of the Church of St Giles up here on the hill, and as you can see, some way away from the village. And immediately next to our site, you can see here a farmstead was located. To the northwest of our site, the whole of this area has got relics of cultivation strips indicative of medieval open field cultivation all over this area here to the northwest of the village. And the remains of these survived into the 19th century, where they were recorded on this early 19th century map. So we know that Cheddington was Anglo-Saxon in origin. For a start, it appears in the Domesday Book, and Cheddington is an Anglo-Saxon name. It derives from the Old English, the first element from chite, which means a cottage or perhaps a hermit's cell, and the second element from dun, meaning a hill. So it's Chiter Dun originally. Now, we've no idea whether this means that there was a hermit's cell on a hill nearby, but it's possible that this might have been the location of St Giles up here on Church Hill. The distance from the village is somewhat curious. It's not unique for sure, but there's usually a good reason why churches were built some way away from the settlements that they were built for. So the location's a bit curious, and it's possible that it may have been built over the site of an earlier shrine. So perhaps, just perhaps, the site of that early hermit's cell on the hill may have been underneath where St Giles now stands, which explains its location up here rather than the more usual location of early churches much closer to the village. So this pattern of the village over here, the manor to the southwest of our site, and the open fields to the northwest of our site gives a basic understanding of how the landscape was organized right the way back in the medieval period, and has implications on how we then went about interpreting the medieval archaeology on the site. So here we are with our earliest medieval remains. So apart from a few sherds of 5th to 7th century pottery that was discovered residually in later features, there was no evidence of activity on the site between, say, the 5th and the 10th centuries. And the earliest recorded medieval activity started in the 10th century with the digging of these shallow curved ditches to create, first of all, in this corner of the site, a small enclosure around about 8 meters wide, 15 meters long, and at least one larger enclosure over here to the west, which was up to 20 meters wide and was at least 50 meters long. And again, like the Iron Age, the earlier Iron Age enclosures, these may have been used for stock penning and stock management. Most of the pottery recovered from these ditches was Roman pottery deposited residually, but there were also sherds of 10th to 11th century date recovered from these ditches. And the majority of the late Saxon pottery recovered from the site was of St. Neots type wares in the typical range of forms. So it had travelled some way from Cambridgeshire. Slightly later on, the small enclosure was modified and enlarged with the digging of this ditch around here, increasing its width up to about 13 meters, but with an access area still here on its southwestern side. Its fill contained pottery suggesting a late 12th century date for the abandonment of this enclosure. Running up to it was this trackway, also constructed with flanking ditches just over 3 meters apart from each other, so creating a width which would have been sufficient for the passage of livestock. And there was also the creation of this linear boundary, which we call Ditch X, heading off in this direction, which was also part of this phase of development. So, despite there being no evidence for Anglo-Saxon habitation, these features are the earliest archaeological evidence we have for medieval activity at Cheddington. The parcels of land defined by these ditches are consistent with interpretations of enclosure forms elsewhere as outlying paddocks and stockyards belonging to manorial type houses. Now, we know we had a medieval manorial manor, Cheddington Manor, to the southwest of our site, and it is perhaps indicative that these were related to that medieval manor, as that is the direction that the trackway leading from this small enclosure is heading southwestwards towards the location of the medieval manor site to the southwest. In the 13th century, the trackway and the small enclosure were replaced by this more formal rectilinear layout of farm paddocks, which we know from our historical map persisted through into the 19th century, indicating a probable medieval origin to the farmhouse that formerly stood just to the southeast of our excavation area in this sort of location. The northeast paddock was around about 30 meters long. The central paddock here, a little smaller at 22 meters long, and both were at least 15 meters wide, continuing to the southwest towards the farm over this way. Several pits of medieval date were excavated within these paddocks, including this pit here, which contained a small assemblage of animal bone, and this may originally have had an industrial purpose, such as tanning. Its final use was certainly for the discard of food waste, and it included a very large assemblage of charred grain and food remains, which included beans, peas, and hazelnuts. Within the charred grain, cereals were predominant, including both spelt and free-threshing wheat, but also barley and rye. Pottery recovered from these features was of 13th to 14th century date, the majority of the glazed wares being of Brill Borstal types, so originating from the Brill Borstal medieval pottery kilns located to the west of Aylesbury, so again, some distance from Cheddington. The land to the northwest of these paddocks over here comprised 2 fields, and this boundary between the two was maintained into the 13th and 14th centuries. No features were recorded in the field to the south of this boundary, but 2 parallel ditches in the field to the north here may be evidence for the establishment and consolidation of furlongs in this area perhaps indicative that this was once another area of open field cultivation. So to put it simply, this plan of 13th century land use on our site seems to reflect the wider landscape use that we can deduce from looking at the early maps of Cheddington, in as much as this area to the southeast was an area of farm paddocks, to the southwest a pasture possibly relating to the medieval manor, and up in this area here, possible open field cultivation relating to the open fields that existed extensively further to the northwest. Well, this 13th century reorganization of our site into paddocks and fields was directly related to the establishment of the adjacent farm. And this time in the 13th century was a time of quite high population growth in England, when new farms and villages were established to make better and more intensive use of the countryside. So we can perhaps surmise that the reorganization of our site in the 13th century was related to wider trends of population growth and settlement across the country. In the late medieval period and into the post-medieval period now, and in contrast to the 13th and perhaps early 14th century extensive evidence from the site, there was really very little evidence that we could date to the 14th or 15th centuries. And again, perhaps this reflects wider events in the country of population decline in the 14th century following the Black Death. Post-medieval activity on the site saw the ongoing retention of these paddock boundaries and the creation of this 8-metre wide and up to 2.3 metre deep ditch, which sort of reinforced the alignment of the paddock boundaries and the fields between the paddock boundaries, between the paddocks, sorry, to the south east and the fields to the northwest. So alongside the paddock boundaries, this monster ditch also appears on our early 19th century maps, where it's clearly shown to connect to a pond over in this area, just on the southern edge of our site. And on at least one map, this is shown as an extension to that pond. So therefore, this was, if you like, a moat or even a canal extension from the pond. So we can imagine this boundary, rather than just being a dry ditch, was filled with water. The concentration of post-medieval activity on the farmstead is reflected in the extent of this soil layer, which developed in and around the area of the paddocks. The soil layer is marked in olive green again on this plan. So it covered, the soil layer as it developed, covered up the earlier features in this area, although the paddock boundaries still persisted in some form into the 19th century. Well, by the time we got to the site in the early 21st century, all that remained above ground of these paddock boundaries were very slight earthworks that we recorded in our earthwork survey at the very beginning of our investigations. So what happened between post-medieval period in the 19th century and when we got to the site that saw the abandonment of the paddocks and the ponds that were recorded within the site in these areas? Here we go. Okay, well, to answer that, I'm going to take you back one last time to our early 19th century map and consider some of the other elements of the historic landscape. As I stated earlier, in the early 19th century, over here, the cultivation strips of former medieval open fields survived to the northwest of our site, including this trackway within our site that gave access to some of these fields in this location. This map also shows us the irregular nature of the routeways and public open spaces that existed around Cheddington in the early 19th century, which included village greens here in Cheddington and also over here in the neighbouring hamlet of West End, which grew up next to the Cheddington Manor. There were also wide trackways among the open fields over here and up over here as well, which probably originated as droveways for the movement of farm stock. So, and then we've got sort of very sort of what appears to be piecemeal development over here of the houses in the hamlet of West End, and the whole of this map speaks of piecemeal development that developed over many centuries, which resulted in this irregular pattern of routes, boundaries, and buildings in the landscape. So this is an early 19th century map. And by the time the 1880 Ordnance Survey map was surveyed, this landscape looked very different. And this was following enclosure of the former open medieval fields. In Cheddington, this enclosure took place in the 1850s, following the enactment of the General Enclosure Act of 1845, which authorised the issuing of enclosure awards without having to submit them to Parliament for approval. Now, around Cheddington, as well as enclosing the former open fields, this process also included rationalisation of the local routeways and open spaces. You can see over here, the wide droveways were gone, as was most of West End and its village green. And the trackway within our site, which was located here, had now been relocated to the north, where a new road ran southwestwards past the site of the former manor and onto the southwest. Within our site, we can also see that the farm paddock boundaries had also mostly disappeared, and the adjacent farm that had once stood there, and we think was probably established in the 13th century, had also vanished. So within just a few years, this landscape that had evolved over centuries had been reorganized and radically altered in the name of agricultural progress, resulting in a field pattern within our site here that persisted pretty much into the 21st century. So there we are. While the features that we uncovered during our excavations at Cheddington were not particularly pretty or spectacular, they have advanced our understanding of past occupation, both within our site and within its historic landscape. And it's added some colour to the story of past occupation in Cheddington and the development of its landscape through the centuries. So I'll leave you with a picture of the site team who did all the hard work. They were led by my former colleague, Jake Streetfield James, who I believe is listening into this talk. And he was assisted by my still current colleague, Ailey Barr, over here. A big thank you to both of them and to the whole of the team for their efforts in sometimes really challenging conditions. But without those efforts, there would have been no story at all to tell you. So thank you to my colleagues, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Martin. There's an opportunity now for Martin and myself to be joined by my former colleague, Lucy Lawrence, who's archaeological advisor at Bucks Council. Lucy and I worked together for probably about 5 or so years, about 6 or 7 years ago, if I've got my maths about right. This was actually one of the first projects she worked on when she joined Bucks Council, advising council on the work we were doing on site. So I'll just ask Lucy to turn her mic on now, if that's possible. Thanks, Lucy. Welcome. Um, and we do have an opportunity now to take questions from the floor. And although I've got a couple of doozy questions for you, Martin, and I'll invite Lucy to join in on those as well. Just looking at some of the questions that have come through, one of the first ones is just a little one about logistics, and it's just about the skeletons, and what's happened to those human remains since we removed them from site.
Well, we've obviously, they were removed from site along with all of the other artifacts and the environmental samples that were taken on site, and taken back to our office in Milton Keynes, where the project was run out of. And there they underwent cleaning, processing, examination, and then were boxed up and packaged up and form part of the site archive, which I believe has now been deposited with Buckinghamshire Museum Service in Aylesbury.
Thank you. Just as the questions start coming through, and just a reminder that Q&A options at the bottom there, so please do pop your questions in there. They're just visible to us, so we can pick them up and maybe even group them together if there's some shared themes coming through. But I wonder if I'll just be a bit cheeky and pick up on one of the things, which was around some of the early phases of interest on the site in the Roman period, when you mentioned about the intentional backfilling of some ditches and the creation of a new, barely noticeably different alignment of the fieldscape and the enclosures that kept those fields. And if the 1976 disco hit by Rolls-Royce taught us anything, there's not a lot much worse than digging a ditch. And I've dug a few ditches in my time as well. Considerable effort, Martin, to dig new ditches, to fill them in, organisation as well as labour. For what seems to us not a lot of difference. But obviously it must have meant more back then. It must have done.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Rob. And that, to me, is one of the sort of most difficult to explain phases of activity on the site. And we can see that other aspects of major development on the site, such as the original Roman rectilinear system, the establishment of the farm in the 13th century, and right the way through to the alterations that took place as a result of the Enclosure Act. We can put them in some sort of context and understand the wider motivations and purposes that those major landscape reorganizations sort of fit into it within their context. But that slight reorganization of the Roman field system is curious to me, because there's hardly any difference in alignment. The strip is much wider, but otherwise I still don't know what they were doing.
I mean, it is worth saying it's not completely unusual to see that across other sites. So it's not specifically special in Cheddington. And we do find ourselves working on sites of a similar period and seeing these big ditches being backfilled and then recut about a foot further to the east on a slightly different alignment. And it is quite hard to get your head around why that energy and effort must have been needed and expended. But obviously, in that particular case, we do have the deposition of an entire cow, wasn't it, Martin? Sorry, apologies. It was an entire cow. So there's obviously something quite important going on regarding the closing, the changing. I've read things about it could have followed a couple of bad harvests, and it was almost kind of like closing the landscape down and kind of refreshing and anew. And something associated with that, and when you start adding that kind of we use the word ritual quite a lot as archaeologists, but actually I mean it specifically in this, the adding of that ritual closing of the landscape and opening it up again, maybe those energies and efforts seem a bit more worthwhile. Just on that subject and expanding it a little bit further geographically, Lucy, I wonder if you just want to come in here and talk a little bit about the Hill Fault project.
Yep, can do. As
Thank you.
Martin explained, the excavation site is just almost adjacent to an Iron Age hill fort, the South End hill fort, and we have a real cluster of hill forts in Bucks and wider in the Chilterns. I think we have 24 hill forts in Buckinghamshire, most of which, as I say, clustered along the Chilterns, but there are some outliers. South End, but also you might not all be aware, but if you carry on further southwest, we have Aylesbury is actually built on a hill fort, and if you carry on a bit further southwest, we have a quite recently discovered hill fort at Long Crendon. So we really have this, focus of hill forts going down along the Chilterns, and then kind of bordering them just to the north, such as the one here at this site. The project that Rob just mentioned, the Hill Forts project, was actually a Heritage Lottery funded project the Chilterns Conservation Board undertook. It's recently finished, where they were looking at the hill forts of the Chilterns, not just Buckinghamshire, and just trying to see what further information could be gathered about them, but also kind of advertise them a bit more, make people in local communities more aware of them. It was a really successful project. It was called Beacons of the Past, and as I say, it has finished up, but there's a lot of legacy kind of material from that project. So new information panels at some of the hill forts, some kind of really good society interaction and projects, and really basic stuff like litter picking. And so it was a really lovely project based on something that's quite unique to this area, and kind of a real essence of the Chilterns and of this area of Buckinghamshire. So the hill fort just on the edge of this excavation site is kind of a really key asset of the area.
Thanks, Lucy. And that extra bit of narrative to kind of really give you the perspective of the wider landscape and how the smaller settlements would have fit in around those larger hill forts really helps to paint that picture. We've had a couple of questions come in on the burials again, so I'm just going to pick up on those before I go back to some of the other questions that have come in about some other core themes. And I see one here from our colleague Martin, from Joe, who's asked the question: do you have any thoughts about the placement of the burials against the field boundaries? And insofar as that's quite a contrast in the way in which burials in rural locations map against those of the slightly denser settlements and the towns.
Well, not really, other than to note that this is a general phenomenon of late Roman burial, that you do often find these inhumations located in the corners of fields, or certainly the rural late Roman burials, adjacent to the edges or in the corners of fields. As I think I said during the talk, it's predominantly these are single inhumations in graves. So to find one with remains of 3 people in it was unusual. But I think the practice of late Roman burials in the corner of fields was fairly widespread across the whole of certainly southern and central Britain.
Thank you. And a specific one which I do know, I believe I know the answer to anyway, but I will pass back to you if that's okay, which is about if we know how the 2 individuals may have died, or the 3 actually, if you include the male burial as well.
Well, it can be implied that the mother and baby died in childbirth. That does seem to be quite likely, unfortunately. Quite why the baby's paternal grandmother or aunt was also buried at the same time is a little bit more puzzling. It may just be circumstance that individual passed away at a similar time. I don't necessarily see anything sinister in the presence of another relation within the grave, relation to the fetus within the grave, and the later male burial. Again, just because it may have been in a pit. Again, that's nothing. There's nothing. I don't see anything particularly sinister in that, in as much as it's not that unusual to find Iron Age and Roman burials within reused pits. And I don't recall there being any evidence on the bones osteologically to give any indication of the cause of death of these individuals. So I'm afraid, other than the mother and baby probably dying in childbirth, I'm afraid I'm unable to answer or add to that, really.
No, it's not unusual, actually, is it, Martin, for especially for burials from 2,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago in this case, for us to have all of the answers to all of the questions we might pose. I've got some more questions which I'm going to group together, and I'll have a quick crack at answering some of them, actually, which was one about why was the middle of the three fields chosen, and can we extrapolate more from what we found in the middle field to the other surrounding fields to understand the landscape? Well, Martin introduced at the beginning of his presentation about that we'd undertaken some trial trenching across all of the areas. And trial trenching is a technique we use. Some of you might be familiar with it, but these are trenches normally 25, 30, 50 meters long and about 2 meters wide. And we scatter those across, sometimes located on areas where we think there might be buried archaeological remains, or sometimes just testing the broader landscape to see if we can find remains. The results of that did pick up a greater intensity of archaeological remains in that central field. So in effect, we didn't go and look in the areas where we weren't expecting to find nothing, where we were expecting to find nothing, I should say. So fundamentally, we'd already come to a conclusion that there was a greater degree of intensity and use of the landscape in this particular field in the middle, rather than the ones on either side. There's another question here about who funds the dig in Cheddington, and that was just introduced to Martin at the beginning. It was the Society of the Merchant Venturers who were paying for the development, and they paid for the archaeology, as is the normal process in development-led, as we call it, archaeological practice in the UK. One from Mike here for you, Lucy. Are you going to go out and do any digging at Cheddington Hill Fort?
What, me personally?
Yeah, absolutely. You personally. I think Mike might want to join in. I think we all might as well, actually.
I haven't got any plans to. No. So as Rob explained, as Martin explained at the beginning, the excavation which was undertaken was done so prior to development. Most works are, because that's who funds them. So, and also, I don't think I'm not sure I'd have permission to just go start digging up scheduled monuments. So no, sorry. There are some really good active archaeological societies in Buckinghamshire. So if people are interested in getting involved, we're really lucky. There's the Buckinghamshire Archaeological Society, there's the Chess Valley Society, the Marlow ones. We have a lot. So if you're interested, do have a bit of a search online and see who you can find, and I'm sure there are some opportunities out there.
Super, thank you. We have a quite a specific question, Martin, about some of the features we found, but also I've just got a question here from Alan about have you used LiDAR mapping? And although I was involved in some of the early stages of the project, I'm afraid I'm going to have to confess I can't remember. It's quite possible, Martin, you might be able to come in and answer that if you can recall. But in this particular case, when we had the very fine earthworks in the field, which are barely visible, they may well have been picked up, more likely than not, that it was the LiDAR that might have picked up on those low, shallow earthworks, which led us to informing the way in which we did the design and the project. So, yeah.
I don't recall LiDAR being undertaken on this project, but it's a good question because, as you say, Rob, it would have been a great tool to record those earthworks remotely. The earthwork survey that we did was by physical measurement in the field, going out there with the GPS and wandering around and measuring tops and bottoms of breaks of slope. But LiDAR technology would have been a really good way to add to that data collection, remotely using there's probably LiDAR available from the Environment Agency that we could use could have used to get probably quite similar results. But I don't recall it being used on this particular project.
If I can just jump in there, since this project has been since 2018, when the excavations happened, there has been some new LiDAR flown of the Chilterns as part of the Beacons of the Past project, which has been mentioned. So the Environment Agency LiDAR, which is readily available, is good to a certain degree, but we've got some much better LiDAR now. And so I wonder if the question is because of the knowledge that some of our audience have of that LiDAR. But unfortunately, as I say, that was only flown since these excavations have taken place.
Thanks, Lucy. We've got a couple of other quite specific questions. Some more on unsurprisingly, the interesting points on the burials and the skeletons. And somebody's asked here, it's surprising that not more skeletons were found. As Martin alluded to, the way in which burials are often located in the corners of fields. We looked into the corners of 3 or 4 fields, in effect, in our work here, and found 3 skeletons. So if there were more, and there are more in the wider landscape, the possibility of more sporadic and occasional burials is quite likely, actually. And Martin, I don't know if you want to come in here with this absolute doozer of a question. What's the population size like in Iron Age Britain into the Roman period? And then another question about the commonality of cremation actually during that period as well versus inhumation.
Well, the simple answer is I don't know the answer to either question. But what I do know is that in the late Iron Age and in the Roman period, the density of rural settlement across much of central and southern Britain was equal, if not greater, than rural settlement today. So it was pretty heavily populated, particularly into the early Roman period. So that, I think, I can't give exact numbers, but the actual pattern of settlement was far more focused on rural settlement as opposed to our preponderance of urban settlement today. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
It was about the likelihood of finding cremations in these periods as well versus
okay.
Yeah,
I'm not an expert on late Iron Age, late Roman burial rites particularly, and I think cremations tended to be earlier Roman, but you do get cremation as a burial rite persisting right the way through the Roman period. But I believe it was more popular in the early Roman in the early Roman period. But as I say, I'm really no expert on this.
Yeah, we're not a million miles away from one of our excavations that we did a webinar on the A120 project, just on the Essex-Hertfordshire border, which did pick up a small little cemetery. I use the word cemetery as a collection of burials, so let's call it a cemetery, which included inhumations and cremations from this period. And in effect, there was some inhumations, and then there were some cremations, and there were some inhumations, and there was cremations. So you were flipping backwards and forwards a little bit between the different types of burial rite, and they're all being buried in a very similar location. So do look up that video. It's on YouTube. You can listen to our colleague Joe talk about that project. There was another question here we just got about how our site fit within the wider landscape during the Roman period, and this was something that Martin picked up on, which was about the nearest important Roman settlement to our site. Correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, but it would have been Verulamium, would have been St Albans, not necessarily the nearest larger settlement, but certainly the nearest largest important settlement to our site. There is a specific question about the pond, Martin. Do we know why the pond was there?
Well, well, why do farms have ponds? I guess for, you know, the keeping of fish, stew ponds, you know, keeping of waterfowl, ducks, that sort of thing. And in this instance, the pond extension to the northeast to you know, between what appears to be fields to the northwest and the paddocks to the southeast was certainly a landscape boundary feature as well. So I think it performed many functions, but basically I think, you know, the reason why farms have got ponds is for, you know, providing water for stock, for keeping fish, ducks, lots and lots of reasons why there would be you'd expect ponds in medieval farmsteads.
Thank you. I guess we've just got a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to keep an eye on the Q&A box. Remember, we're using the Q&A box, not the chat box, for questions coming in at the moment. And I'm wondering if actually I would just open up to Lucy and Martin on the further reading. If you want to learn any more about our excavations here and in the wider area, do you want to pick that up first of all, Lucy?
I would always recommend, if the first port of call for further information about Buckinghamshire in particular would be our online interactive mapping site, which is if you put into your search engine the Buckinghamshire Heritage Portal. That's basically got accessible online interactive material relating to the majority of what we hold on our historic environment record. So you can find out about different monuments and find spots and the results of excavations which have happened in the county. It's also got things such as parish summaries and school packs. So it's a really, really good source of information. And then also, of course, for Buckinghamshire, if you want to do some actual physical reading, there is our county journal, so the records of Buckinghamshire, which has kind of short articles about different sites that have you know, been excavated in the county and summaries, etc. But I mean, if you really want to delve into it, you can go into the grey literature libraries of all the different archaeological contractors and see what you can find. Definitely don't just stick to the borders of Buckinghamshire. The information's out there.
Yeah, I would. I'm more than happy to jump in there and say, have a look at Cotswold Archaeology's reports online page. I want to always start that with award winning. We haven't won an award. Maybe I'm going to give ourselves an award because to be honest, it's bloody brilliant. It's one of the best things we've ever done. I've been working at the company for a little over a decade. And I think it's such an important resource. It's a really easy function of using a map to allow you to search for different types of projects. You can zoom in into the area you're interested in, find about projects we've worked on. We've worked all over the country, so you can find all sorts of interesting projects right on your doorstep that we might have worked on as well. Martin, I'll pass back to you if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. I've got little to add other than the sources that Lucy and Rob have talked about. With regard to this particular site, there's a publication, a summary of the site was published in Records of Buckinghamshire, I think last year. So I think it's in the most recent volume of Records of Buckinghamshire. So you can read all about it there. And if you want to know even more information about what we discovered, we do have our grey literature excavation report, which includes all of the specialist information and detail. And as Rob said, that's available on our Cotswold Archaeology Reports Online website. I'm sure, Lucy, it's probably available at the HER as well. So those would be the two main sources to follow up on this particular site. I gave a snapshot of the current archaeology article that appeared at the end of last year as well. That's just a very brief summary about the ancient DNA sequencing from the site. And ultimately, I guess we will all appear on the Cotswold Archaeology YouTube channel, probably in a week or two. So if you really like this, you can watch it all again in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you, Martin. And while I invited some additional questions while we were just rounding up there, we had a question from Jake, who Martin alluded to earlier, who directed things on site. And we've got another question from Tilia, and also from a question from Debbie as well, asking about where she can find a copy of Martin's favourite map. Actually, in answer to all of the questions that have just come in the last few seconds, and the one with the map, is the answer Martin just gave. If you have a look at our report that's on Reports Online, you'll be able to find additional details about some of the ironworking on site, some additional details about some of the pottery assemblage, which was one of the other questions. And unless Martin's about to correct me, I'm pretty sure we've got a nice copy of one of those maps in there as well.
And of course, if you're interested in maps, you can always visit the record office in Aylesbury, where we have copies of lots of different historic maps.
Yes. Going back further in time than some of the ones that Martin was talking about today as well, actually. So that leaves me to just say thank you to Lucy for joining us on the panel. Double thank you to Martin for a wonderful presentation and lecture on the subject. And thank you all for joining and listening to this webinar. I mentioned earlier about the importance of getting feedback. We really do like to receive your feedback so we can tailor our events to match your needs and what you'd like to hear from us, which does give me the opportunity to advertise our next one, which is our annual lecture on the 7th of June, which will be a hybrid event. We'll be broadcasting live and in person, holding a lecture in Cirencester on the subject of Roman tile production in Minety in Wiltshire, which was an excavation we undertook relatively recently, which involved community involvement as well, so it's a really great project to learn about how the community can get involved in excavations, but also about this really important investigation of the Roman tile production. It's really changed the way in which we thought about tile production and distribution in the Roman period in that part of Wiltshire. So thank you, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and I'll just leave it for Lucy and Martin to say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.